This is the world's first mini PC to be powered by Intel's 13th generation i9. Meaning, in a computer that can literally fit in the palm of your hand, you have a chip with more power than some full-sized desktops out there. Now, when Geekom first reached out to sponsor this video, I didn't realize that mini PCs had even gotten this good. The mini PCs that we have here in the studio have all been pretty basic machines, but on the IT13, we have that 14-core 20-thread i9 that can boost up to 5.4 gigahertz. The Iris Xe graphics have 96 execution units. There is 32 gigabytes of RAM, along with a whopping 2 terabytes of storage with super fast Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.2, which at less than $800 is pretty good. I mean, compared to something like Apple's Mac Mini, you're getting 4 times the amount of RAM and 4 times the storage, while also being significantly smaller. But what I like about the IT13 is, despite its size, it still has a ton of I/O, certainly more than what you get with the Mac Mini. On the back, there are 2 super fast USB 4 ports, which with 40 gigabits of bandwidth, not only can you connect things like 8K monitors at 30 Hz, but you can also connect to eGPUs, which I'm pretty excited about testing later on in this video. On top of that, you also get 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, meaning technically, if you wanted to, you could run a quad display from this tiny machine. For networking, in addition to Wi-Fi 6E, you also get a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, and then a couple of Type A ports, one of which is USB 3.2. On the left side, we actually have a full-sized SD slot, which is something that you don't often see in this form factor. Even some laptops that are much bigger don't have one, so that's something I really like to see. And then on the right side, it's another vent with a Kensington lock. Up front, there are 2 more USB 3.2 ports, along with a headphone jack and a power button. But before we boot it up, let's take a look at the inside, because Geekom has made it really easy to open this thing up and upgrade the components. There are just 4 screws in total, and then this bottom lid lifts right off. You do have a little ribbon cable to be careful with, but that's pretty much it. So here's the 2TB SSD from Lexar. There's another slot for more M.2 storage for another terabyte, and then hidden away in the lid is actually a slot for a 2.5-inch SATA drive. So you can technically have up to 3 different drives in this thing, which is pretty wild. For RAM, we have 32 gigabytes of DDR4. I was kind of hoping that it would be DDR5 for those faster speeds, but you know, DDR4 is fine. And then if we dig in further, it's the processor and the fan, but it does get kind of tricky to access all that. So for now, I'm just gonna put it all back together, which is nice and easy. Okay, so booting this thing up is surprisingly fast. I clocked it in at just 8 seconds, which is insane. It's easily the fastest booting computer in our entire studio. Now, in terms of general performance running Windows 11 Pro, everything is super snappy. I mean, this doesn't really come as a surprise with the i9 and like 32 gigabytes of RAM. And I was able to have a bunch of common apps like Chrome and Excel open, and even a game, and then multitask between them without any issues. But I wanted to see how this i9 could perform under more heavy loads. So the first thing I tested was opening up some of our own 10-bit 8K videos. We're talking about some massive files here, and the IT13 didn't have any issues playing them back. Jumping into Premiere, even though we don't have a dedicated GPU, I could still scrub through and edit this 4K project without any issues. It's not the most intensive project, but it does have multiple layers, and scrubbing through it, playing back, and applying effects was all smooth. The only area where I noticed that performance took a hit was when it was a GPU intensive task like exporting, at which point the integrated graphics on this thing became the bottleneck. But for light and occasional editing, this is totally fine. Now in Photoshop, which is more CPU based, performance is great. Importing a 50 megapixel RAW photo, doing a bit of color grading, and doing tasks like object selection all worked flawlessly. So with the full-size SD slot, this is a nice little setup for editing photos. But this next test is where we really get to see the power of the i9. We have a custom Excel sheet that calculates trillions of operations as soon as you open it, where with the i9 and its 14 cores and 20 threads, the IT13 was able to complete the task in just 19 seconds, whereas on Apple's M2 chip with 8 cores, it took 29 seconds to complete, so a clear win for the i9. In Cinebench though, the result wasn't as impressive. We got a score of just under 12,000, which for the 13th generation i9 does seem a little bit lower than you'd expect it to be, but I think that's because Geekom has really tuned this thing for power efficiency and to help keep that i9 running cool. I did try tuning the CPU with Intel's tuning utility to remove some of the TDP limits on here, where after running the benchmark again, we get a massive improvement with it scoring over 2,500 points higher. Although I really wouldn't recommend doing this since you don't want to damage the chip and cook it, and also it'll most likely void your warranty. So I just set everything back to the default. Okay, so even though this wasn't necessarily designed for gaming, I still wanted to see how it would do. And at least in Valorant, it kind of surprised me, with it getting an average of 127 frames per second. And this was at 1080p. It was on the low settings, of course, but still, with only integrated graphics, getting over 120 FPS is impressive. In a more taxing game like GTA 5, we were still getting a totally playable 60 FPS. This was at 1080p on normal settings, so obviously the visuals aren't gonna blow you away, but I don't know, I think it's pretty cool that you can still run a AAA title on this thing. But obviously, not all games run as smoothly. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was only getting around 30 frames per second, but that was with Intel's XeSS off. But if you turn on XeSS, where it uses AI to upscale the graphics, the average FPS actually jumped up to 38 frames per second, which isn't bad. But of course, if you really want to take gaming and any GPU related tasks to the next level, that's the point at which you take advantage of that USB 4 port on the back and connect it to an eGPU, where after plugging in our 3080 Ti, bam, all of a sudden, this thing became a gaming PC. At our monitor's max resolution of 1440p, we were seeing an average of 405 FPS in Valorant with everything turned all the way up. In GTA 5, with everything maxed out, we were still getting 136 frames per second, and even in Tomb Raider, with everything turned up, we were getting around 98 frames a second. And then in an app like Premiere Pro, those GPU-intensive tasks that I was talking about earlier were around 5 times faster. So having that option for an eGPU, even if it's somewhere later down the line, is really, really nice. But for most workflows, I don't really think you'd even need it. The i9 and the Iris Xe graphics are more than capable, as we've already seen, and for everyday stuff, it's just a blazingly fast experience. In fact, I would say that having an i9 on here might actually be overkill. And Geekom does have options with the i5 and the i7 for the IT13, so you could save some money there if you want. However, keep in mind that those models do come with less storage. Either way though, even if you go with the most powerful i9, you're still getting a better deal than something like Intel's NUC, which currently goes for nearly $1,000 while only having the i7. And with Intel also announcing that they're exiting the NUC business entirely, this Geekom PC could just be your next NUC. I'll be dropping all the links and info you need down below in the description, including any discounts, so be sure to check that out. But anyways, that is it for me in this video. Big thanks to Geekom for sending this unit out to us and sponsoring this episode. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the very next episode.